All right, we're making great progress. It's now time to have a look at specificity. We'll be discussing the Cascade and conflicting selectors, specificity, and specificity calculations. Let's dive in. Before we look at specificity, let's do a quick recap of the Cascade. The Cascade is about how styles declared later will take priority when the selectors are the same. For example, looking at this snippet of HTML, we have an H1. In CSS, we could style this selector by using the type selector to grab the H1 and then give it a color of blue. Later on in the sheet, we can grab the H1 again using the type selector. So in this example, we're using the same selector, the H1 type selector. And we know because of the cascading nature of CSS, styles declared later will take priority. So in this case, green overrides blue. So the H1 will no longer be styled blue, it will be styled green. Let's now talk about what happens when we have conflicting selectors. When styles are applied to the same element using a different type of selector, the outcome is determined by specificity. So what do we mean by this? Let's say we had the same HTML we saw before, but now we've added a class attribute with the value heading. Now in the CSS, we're going to style this heading in two different ways. The first is using the class heading, where we have the notation period or full stop, followed by heading. And the second is using the type selector H1. So now in this case, we have different selectors, a class selector and a type selector, but they're both targeting the same H1 element. And not only are they targeting the same element, they're applying conflicting styles. The class selector is styling the heading to be blue, whereas the type selector is styling the heading to be green. Now up until this point, you would say to me that because the type selector H1 with the color green is declared after the class selector, the color of the heading will be green, because we know the nature of the cascade is that styles declared later will take priority. However, this is not the case. The green does not override the blue. And this is where specificity comes into play. Now, to understand specificity, we're going to be looking at sports tables. In a sports table, team rankings are determined using a system of priority. I'm going to be looking at the English Premier League. Currently, Arsenal is in first place, Man City in second place, and Liverpool in third place. The rankings of the teams are determined by things like wins, draws, and goal difference, where as we move from the left to the right, the numbers have a lower priority, where as we know a win is more substantial than a draw, and a draw is more substantial than goal difference. We can see Arsenal has 7 wins. This puts them in first place as they have the most wins. Looking now at Man City and Liverpool, they both have the same number of wins, 5 each, and they also have the same number of draws, 4 each. So the place in the table is determined by goal difference. Man City has 20, and Liverpool has 8. So Man City is in second place as they're ahead on goal difference. Now if you were to just look at the numbers on this table, 20 is the largest. It's the value of Man City's goal difference. Now this is the largest number, but it's also the lowest priority. As I mentioned at the start, a win is much more substantial than a goal difference. So as a team in the EPL, it's a lot more important to have 1 win over say 100 goal difference. The category of win, draw, and goal difference is really important and have a lower priority as we move from left to right. This same principle applies to specificity. So what is specificity? Specificity determines the priority of a CSS rule when multiple rules apply to the same element. Let's have a look at this snippet of HTML. We have an H1 nested inside a div, which is then nested inside another div. In our CSS, we have 4 different ways of selecting the same element. The first rule is using the ID selector. The second rule is using the descendant selector, where the class textbox is the parent and the class large is the child. The third rule is also using the descendant selector, where we're first selecting the div as the parent using the type selector, then selecting the next div down as the child using the type selector, and then using the class large, which is the grandchild, to select the heading. And the fourth rule again uses the descendant selector, but instead of using the class large to select the heading, we're using the type selector H1. So all these CSS rules are selecting the same element, the H1, but they're using a mix of different selectors, and they're all trying to apply a different color. So which color ends up being applied? If you need a refresher how ID and class selectors as well as descendant selectors work, I've linked those videos in the description below. So let's now work out which of these rules apply. To do that, we need to do a specificity calculation. A specificity calculation is very similar in nature to the sports table, where instead of wins, draws, and goal differences, we have the type of selector, ID, class and pseudoclass, and type, where as we move from left to right, these selectors have a lower priority. So an ID selector is like a win, a class and pseudoclass selector is like a draw, and a type selector is like a goal difference. So let's now go through all 4 CSS rules we just saw earlier and tally this up. The first selector was the ID selector heading. There's just one ID selector here, so this gets 1 point. There's no class or pseudoclass selector, and there's no type selector. The next rule we saw was the descendant selector using 2 classes. There are no IDs here, so this gets 0, and there are 2 class selectors here, text box and large, so this gets 2 points. And there are no type selectors, so we get 0 points. The next CSS rule looked like this. There are no ID selectors, so this gets 0 points. There is one class selector being used, large, so this gets 1 point. And there are 2 type selectors, the 2 divs, so this gets 2 points. The last rule looked like this. In this case, there are no IDs being used, so the ID column gets 0. There are no class and pseudoclasses being used, so we give 0 here. And there are 3 type selectors being used, div, div, and h1. So the type column gets 3 points. So the ID selector heading is at the top of the table. Back to the football analogy, it's like it has 1 win, whereas all the other selector combinations don't have any wins. And we say that this selector has the highest specificity. In other words, it's the most specific selector used. And you can see each row is ordered correctly in terms of its specificity. For example, the next row down, where we have the 2 classes text box and large, this uses 2 classes, which is like 2 draws. So that's a higher specificity of the combination below it, the div, div, and large class, where that only has 1 class and 2 type selectors. And once again, if you look at this table, the largest number on it is 3, which are 3 type selectors on the div, div, and h1. But the biggest number doesn't matter, because the type is like goal difference. It isn't such an important number compared to an ID, which is like a win. So let's finish up by talking about some specificity guidance. Long story short, don't worry too much about it. The concept of specificity and the calculations behind it can seem a bit confusing. I can assure you, you're not going to be sitting there with a calculator trying to work out its specificity value whenever you're applying a CSS rule. Specificity is just something you need to know about so that you understand when you're applying conflicting selectors, which one is winning and why. The reason I don't want you to worry too much about it is because it is common to use the type selector for global styles and the class selector to override this for specific styling. For example, on this page, the heading 2 over here would be a global style with a specific font weight, color, font size, etc. So by default within our application, all H2s will be styled this way. Within the application, there may be specific circumstances we want to override that default global styling. For example, this H2 over here, we could create a class called white, where we would override the H2 color property with a white color using the class. And the reason this works is because a class selector is more specific than a type selector. So long story short, don't stress about specificity. We're generally going to be styling global styles using type selectors and using class selectors to override this style for specific cases. It is also important to understand the concept of specificity so that when you write your own CSS and rules aren't being applied as you'd expect, you can start thinking about the specificity of conflicting selectors. So let's finish off this video by completing the summary card, pseudoclasses and specificity. In this video, we looked at specificity. We saw that specificity determines priority of a CSS rule when multiple conflicting rules are applied to the same element. We looked at an example of HTML like this, where we were targeting the H1 in 4 different ways. we saw that we could calculate the specificity of each selector, where ID, class and pseudoclass, and type selectors had a lower priority from left to right. In the example, we looked at 4 different cases, where filling in the table, the heading was 100, the 2 class selectors was 020, the 2 type selectors and class was 012, and the 3 type selectors was 003. And therefore the heading, which is an ID class, had the highest specificity, as any ID selectors were much more specific than a class or pseudoclass or type selector, just like a goal was more important than a draw. The guidance we saw was that we used the type selector for global styles and class selector to override for specific styling. Don't forget, you can download all the summary cards and presentation slides from the bootcamp in the link in the description below. You know what to do. Show some love in the comments below, subscribe here, and click here to move on to the next video in the playlist.